I've always been interested in changing the world, effectively. And also I have 2 young children. You know, when I look at them, I think, well, fuck, if I don't do something, then I'm massively letting you down.
Unless there is some break on neoliberal globalisation, which is making the poor poorer and the wealthy wealthier, we'll see increasingly clashes.
People are seeing that these are global problems, and so they want to be part of something that is an alternative.
I recently graduated my Masters in Women's Wear Fashion from Royal College of Art. Through those studies, I kind of started to become more aware of the climate emergency, and it became quite clear to me that changing the fashion industry is essentially is a waste of time when the fashion industry is within a system that is broken. And it became more clear that system change is what we need. And then I heard about Extinction Rebellion, the Fashion Week protest they did. These guys are incredible, and I'm studying fashion, but right now I'm absolutely certain that I'd rather be on that side of the building.
For me, it's a real moment of reckoning for an industry which fears cultural irrelevance. Because if we went and did a mock funeral outside a fossil fuel conference, they'd go, go home now, we don't care about you, we're much bigger and stronger than you. But the fashion industry are fearful of the change in culture in a way which I think presents a unique opportunity to deal with a very, very polluting and toxic industry.
This is an emergency. And then we have the Cancel London Fashion Week campaign to get the British Fashion Council to cancel London Fashion Week in its current system, and instead use that platform of influential power they have to educate people about the crisis, to tell the truth.
I think people are turning more to protest because of, on the one hand, the unbearable living conditions, despite the fact that people are in work, in many cases not able to make ends meet. The other, I think, is a combination of fear and anxiety about the future, over climate change, war, economic crisis.
What this spike in social protest shows us, electoral politics is failing to cohere some of the kind of bigger cries for help, change, reform that the old parties aren't cutting in.
One of the most fundamental things about protests and demonstrations is that people are trying to find ways of getting their voice heard, being able to put forward a political message without the backing of other political institutional forms.
Language can be a very effective way, can be used to communicate the messages of the protesters, but can also provide a very valuable window on the value systems, the cultural settings, the wider context in which a protest movement is taking place.
When it comes to using their language, I think social protest is becoming increasingly blunt, which I think is different to being crude.
Furthermore, we call on all rebels to come out and continue the rebellion.
In most of these cases, you get something simple, repeatable, mimetic, that can be taken and used and applied, sometimes across oceans. Me Too pretty much works anywhere. Black Lives Matter works in most places where there are black people, but even when there aren't black people, there are people who are stigmatised and brutalised.
When do we want it? Now! What do we want? So Extinction Rebellion was born out of a group of activists called Rising Up, which was a decentralised kind of network across the UK of people interested in testing out tactics of civil disobedience and non-violent direct action. The Arts Factory, I guess it was born out of the idea that you need to produce stuff to serve the movement.
She doesn't wear anything, she needs a bit of help on there. I'll get there.
So at the heart of the design that we created was this idea that it could be expanded by other people.
And then they'll get used and we'll get feedback on what makes people happier. Like the big one's really good for like tying to trees, but...
Yes.
And like, I mean, the idea was that one person could like unfold it. React on P. We're printing these for the fashion action going into action on Saturday. I mean, everything we do has a certain look and a feel at the moment. I mean, it just started by me making these things. Like, the advantage is I make a thing, and then I can print with it on banners and or flags or on people's clothing. Oh, fantastic. That's the best one yet. And then from the same object, we get like a very simple black and white image, which then goes to the graphic designers. And they work really well on the web as well.
We're printing symbol flags for an action on Saturday. They have a specific colour palette. And then we do a little shuffle. And we have very strict consent rules when we're on the block.
It's about mass producing, but it's still handmade, and it's about working collectively together. I think that's...
Yeah, that's the most important thing, is that we're a do-it-together community of artists, so that we have lots of different skills, but when we're in the factory, we just hone down into sewing and printing.
I think in a time of crisis, in a time of emergency, and we've kind of seen that throughout history as well, is that creativity is more important than ever. We have a really clear set of colours that we use. We're always using the same type font, we're always using the same symbols. But I also think there's something to the language that we're using that is quite clear and quite bold, but also quite honest. So if the situation is fucked, we say it's fucked, because that's the way it is.
When we set out, there was like no one else talking like that. You know, when we made that banner that said climate change, we're fucked, and hung it over the side of the Westminster Bridge, it was really like an experiment with language for us, because nobody would say it. It's like, okay, well, everyone says it in the boardroom at Greenpeace, but they don't fucking write it in their newsletter, do they? What's going on? You know, and I had meetings with environmentalists who were like, we know that our organisation is engaged in a strategy of managed defeat. Well, I'm sure their membership don't know that they say that, right, over lunch.
Idea with the placards is to have coherent visual of the protest, but also to make them in a very DIY approach so people can actually just replicate it and do it at home, but still contribute to that coherent visual aspect.
The idea of intertextuality is often used very creatively. You appropriate the language of someone else and put it to new use for yourself. Extinction Rebellion's fashion action group took some very almost cliched slogans from the fashion world and then put a spin on them for their own purposes.
Green is the new black is a classic example that people are bringing their own contribution, and that is something we see quite often because it's such a fashion language.
A lot of the messaging, I think, at the beginning was focused on being this very big container, and what's important about doing it that way is that then people can put their smaller messages inside and people can bring more nuanced points of view.
So take something like rebel and make it a positive thing, then that actually has a massive psychological impact on people. Because, you know, you're saying it's good to rebel. And in fact, you can rebel for life. And rebelling for life is a really, really good thing, because actually we all need life. And so you're taking something that's considered negative by the mainstream culture and making it a positive.
And again, that's why I think people try to make things very visual, very real, and keep the words fairly concise and fairly simple.
Very difficult to define what a successful protest placard would look like. I would say, well, it has to be one that draws your attention, and it has to be one that brings the message across effectively. It has to be striking. Remember that in any protest landscape, there will be milliards of people carrying protest signs, all of them competing for attention, all of them want to be captured by, well, people's eyes and camera lenses.
I think protest has changed a lot over the last decade or so, and the primary thing that has changed it, not the only thing, is new technology. That new technology has kind of caffeinated the nature of protest and kind of a virtual presence which can be both huge and elusive. They exist as hashtags. They key into something real. They mobilize sometimes millions of people, but they can disappear as quickly as they appear.
Social media has changed the sort of participatory aspect of demonstration, and that's definitely had an impact on the type of placards people are making. Almost a celebration of this homegrown creativity expressed through placards. The fact that people will take a photograph of it, the photograph then will spread online, might get picked up by a newspaper.
In some ways, I think, with the internationalisation of protest and the globalisation of protest, I think English is increasingly being used. But if you look at, for example, the Arab world, I think most slogans are still in local languages. Most slogans are appealing to governments. Most slogans are appealing to other citizens. But of course, you are seeing through social media the increasing use of English.
I don't think that English can be considered an international language of protest. I mean, I do think that it is a global language, so lots of people use it. I doubt that the Gilets jaunes are demonstrating in English.
And there's a great example in Holland. They realised that's a massive mistake, because when they did their first action in Holland, which was it's something to do with the Dutch royal family. They have some sort of festival in Amsterdam at a certain point, and a load of them jumped in the canal, basically, to disrupt this ceremony. And they got accused by the local press of being foreign students because all of the messaging was in English. So they quickly realised that mistake, and obviously everything they've done since has been in Dutch.
So I think when we set out, you might know that we used to say we'll shift the Overton window on firstly on the language that we use to describe the situation that we're in, but also on the impression of what a responsible response looks like. What's an appropriate thing to do in a moment like this? And arguably, I think we've done that quite well. The emergency bells are ringing through the mainstream media now, and they didn't really seem like they were before.
Hopefully we've changed the way people to refer to climate change to something where we begin to refer to it as climate crisis rather than climate change.
But I think by keep repeating our name, by keep repeating who Extinction Rebellion is, and keep repeating that we are in a mass extinction event, it's going to start to resonate with people. Maybe not now, maybe not in the moment, but it's going to start to, it's planting seeds in a way, and make sure that we keep watering them.
And we are singing, singing for our lives.
And the reality is that to fight gives no guarantee of success, but not to fight is guaranteed failure.
And we are singing, singing for our